Overall, Unit 8 is bringing together a lot of the key concepts and things that you might think of as biological, looking at broad strokes and interactions between organisms. This is going to incorporate both behavior and the normal ecology components because it's looking at how systems interact, how available energy is used, how they respond to change, communities and ecosystem structures, all of that thing. So it's going to tie together a lot of big concepts. The first concepts is how do plants respond to changes in the environment? Well, the most common example of that is how plants respond to changes in light. They have photoreceptors, they pick up different spectrums of light, different wavelengths, and they're going to respond in different ways to different colors of light. Okay, for example, the far red light is more likely to inhibit germination than the red light. And we find that the far red light is more common in going into sort of like winter and that kind of thing. So plants are able to set their internal clocks and control their flowering because of differences in wavelengths of light. Not only does it control the timing of their processes, it also determines what they do physically. So photomorphogenesis, or the dark version, scotomorphogenesis, you see in the potatoes that it's much more root focused. It's seeking that light before light is exposed. And once it actually has found light, it will begin to produce leaves and roots and all of that structures. And it's all the phytochromes that are going to be triggering that. The phytochromes are going to trigger secondary messengers, in this case cGMP, which is like CAMP, but with guanine, which will trigger kinase, which will trigger transcription, all of those processes. The same things that we looked at in cell biology are occurring in the plants, but their major driver is going to be light. Plants are able to respond to other stimuli like gravity, for example. Roots grow down, the shoots grow up. They need to be able to know which direction that is. They do that through organelle structures called statoliths. Other responses might be to touch, it might be to chemical presence, might be to water presence, but that's all part of the broad concept. When you actually are looking at animal behavior, this is going to be based upon physiological systems. An individual behavior is going to be an action carried out by muscles under control of the nervous system in response to stimuli. But overall, we find that most biological traits can be linked into two causal sections. Okay, the first is the proximate causation. How does a behavior occur? And then the other is the ultimate causation. Why does a behavior occur in the context of natural selection? Okay, so think how, proximate, ultimate, why. Okay, and that's going to be sort of a broad scope. Overall, though, behavior requires communication. Signals function through here. They generate a signal. That signal generates a response. Boom, you have communication. It might be chemical, like pheromones and the alarm pheromones of minnows. It might be sounds, like the crickets. Or it might be physical structures and behaviors, like the waggle dance of bees. But these are all going to be types of communication. Other sort of guiding structures are going to be orientation behaviors. You had the tropisms of plants. That is sort of directional growth, whereas we have kinesis and taxis in animals. Kinesis is going to be a change in rate. Basically, if you're in an environment you like, you're going to be moving more slowly. If you're in an environment you don't like, you'll move more quickly to try to find those good environments. Whereas taxis is going to be directional movement to whatever your stimuli is. So these euglena here have positive phototaxis. They move towards the light because they're photosynthetic. Okay, the simplest form of behaviors are innate behaviors. Okay, this is going to be fixed action patterns where they have that response, or it could be something like an instinct, like for a dolphin, how to swim, or it could be genetically controlled, like the courtship behavior of a fruit fly. Okay, those innate behaviors are controlled and automatic to the organisms. The closest humans have to innate behaviors are probably reflexes. Learning is going to be a change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. They're less rigid, they can be modified to suit changing environments. The most basic is going to be maybe imprinting, where it's sort of that critical period of early development, and they imprint on the mother, in this case the scientist. It could be habituation, where you learn to ignore stimuli that are bothersome. It's kind of like the cry wolf. Or it could be spatial learning, where you learn based upon landmarks and physical situations and behaviors. Okay, so lots of different fairly basic learned behaviors. Those can get more complicated. Learning is going to lead to animals modifying their behavior based upon information in their environment. But if you can connect one stimuli to a different response, that's going to be an associative learning process, which is really going to be kind of like looking at conditioning. Is it to arbitrary response, okay, like Pavlov's dog, or is it sort of a give and take operant conditioning structure, like the trial and error learning kind of thing, reward and punishment, like the Skinner box? More complex behaviors are going to come from social learning and culture and society. Okay, that's going to be some of the more advanced intersocial, interconnective structures, and technically we're doing social learning right now. Okay, cognition is going to be the most advanced. This is going to be complex learning, problem solving, basically knowing represented by awareness, reasoning, recollection, and judgment. The bees, for example, can tell blue to food. If you get rid of the color and change pattern, they still follow that same to same. So they have learned that the food is going to be on the side that matches the exterior. So that would be a very simple example of cognition. Is behavior controlled by genetics? Well, there's lots of pieces of information that show us that genetic inheritance can be an indicator of behavior, like the call of the lacewing, the mating behavior of a fruit fly, or the migratory pattern of the birds on the far right. But other studies have shown us that the behavior can be influenced by environment and energy levels and all of these foraging behavior structures. Cross-fostering studies and twin studies have shown us that behavior can be environmentally affected. So is it nature? Is it nurture? It's both. They're both involved. Some traits fall under sexual selection characteristics. For example, agonistic interactions, and when you have males fighting other males. You have monogamous behaviors with and polygynous and polyandrous behaviors, also being related to sexual dimorphism. So the more elaborate the male is, for example, the more likely they are to be polygynous. Okay, whereas the more similar the male and the female are, the more likely organisms to be monogamous. We also find that there are going to be mate choice seeking behaviors. Females tend to choose males that are like their fathers, and other ones, basically organisms are more attractive if they are perceived to be more attractive by others of the same gender. Sexual sort of mate choice copying. So definitely sexual selection is one of those major drivers of behavior. Another major driver of behavior is parental care. There's all sorts of parental care, mom only, dad only, both parents, or more of a colony. Okay, that's going to be, we find that parental care is linked to certainty of paternity. Basically, a male is more likely to be involved in raising the young if they are certain that it is their young. Alloparental care is going to be more common in something like insects or bees or like naked mole rats, where you pretty much have one dominant breeder and the rest are supported, but it gets really complicated. We find kin selection to be a major driving here for altruistic and sort of sacrificial behaviors. Most social behaviors are actually selfish. They benefit the individual at the expense of their competitor. Behaviors that maximize an individual's survival and reproductive success are favored. But sometimes we do things that are not selfish. And we find there's a relationship here to kin selection. So the more closely related you are, the more likely you are to give of yourself, basically. So relatedness times benefit. If that is greater than the cost, then a trait, an altruistic trait, is likely to emerge. The other type of altruism, reciprocal altruism, basically it's based upon likelihood of return. So if you think another organism is likely to return that altruistic behavior at a later point, then you are more likely to engage in that behavior. Outside of behavior, you start looking at issues of energy. Energy flows and is ultimately lost. Thermodynamics is lost as heat, whereas matter cycles, biogeochemical cycles, moving around and around and around. It's going to be very different depending on what you're looking at. Okay, the mushrooms on the far right, for example, are decomposers. So they're going to be putting things back into the primary production cycle, but they are going to be using up energy in the process. So they are still using energy even though they are returning matter to the environment. Primary production, the net primary production is equal to the gross primary production minus respiration. So production looks at the photosynthetic and maybe chemosynthetic, depending upon where you are, amount of energy capture. Some of that energy we'll use to keep the organism alive, that's respiration, and the rest is available to the ecosystem. That would be our net primary productivity. Some of that energy is lost, energy partitioning. So looking at issues of efficiency here, insects, for example, are more efficient than mammals. Cold-blooded, so-called like endotherms versus ectotherms. Okay, they're going to be more. If you are using your energy to drive your own body heat and through the process, you're going to spend more energy to stay alive. So the efficiency is going to differ depending on what type of organism that you are looking at. Overall, though, the average is about 10%. So most of the time, about 10% of the energy is going to go into growth and new biomass, and that is going to be the energy that is available to the next trophic level, the actual secondary production. So that 10% rule is going to drive this. If the plants represent 100% of the available energy, then the grasshopper here is able to absorb 10%, the shrew 1%, the snake 0.1%, and so on. So food chains tend to be fairly short because energy is loss. And when you take all of those food chains and tie them together, you get the food web. Just be careful with the arrows. The arrows always point to where the energy is going, not to where the energy came from. Okay, so it's looking at the flow of energy through this process. But the efficiency is going to be different depending upon the type of organism that you're looking at. Plants are able to absorb about 1% of solar energy, and then from there we have roughly 10%. You might end up with sort of these pyramids that are a little skewed, like the one on the right. There's so few producers and so many consumers. How is this possible? Well, the producers are reproducing significantly faster, so they're able to sustain that process. So you could end up with some weird structures. Biogeochemical cycles, we're doing sort of a quick overview. Make sure you understand how they work because they're likely to be asked. The water cycle is driven by solar energy, moving water, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, percolation through the soil, filtration, all of that. CO2 is going to be driven back and forth by cell respiration and photosynthesis. We get the general idea. For each of these things, also realize how humans are altering them. Humans are overusing fresh water. Humans are burning fossil fuels, that kind of thing. The nitrogen cycle is the most tested because the nitrogen cycle looks at the capture of nitrogen. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen, but most of it's not biologically available. It needs to be fixed by bacteria. Okay, the bacteria will fix it as ammonia, and then they will turn it into nitrates and nitrites, which will then be absorbed by plants and other bacteria, and those things will then be consumed by animals, and then waste products will break that nitrogen back down into ammonia and then into nitrogen gas. Okay, so bacteria are the major driving forces here. The phosphorus cycle doesn't have a gaseous component, it only sort of driven by dust, so this one's very short distances, but it's still a needed nutrient for plant growth, so it comes up. And you could have other cycles as well, like sulfur, for example. Sulfur comes up the most because sulfuric acid, along with a nitrogen cycle and nitric acid, those lead to acid range changes. The phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle are tied together because of fertilizer use. Okay, so biogeochemical cycles could come up in a lot of different ways. Population is going to be going up because of births and immigration. Populations will be going down because of deaths and emigration, but overall we'll see population change over time because of that value. Immigration and emigration are often excluded, so you might just be looking at births and deaths. If you need to estimate the size of a population, the most common example here is the mark recapture formula on the right. You have the number marked on the first visit times the number captured on the second visit divided by the number that were recaptured. So basically the number in the second capture that were marked from the first capture goes on the bottom. That will give you an estimation of a population size. There are other ways to do that, but that's the one that this class uses. How will populations actually disperse? Sometimes they'll be clumped around resources like humans tend to do. Sometimes they'll be uniform, mainly because of things like territoriality. And sometimes they'll be random because of homogeneous environments. But we see lots of different changes there. So they're going to distribute over time because of interactions between physical access, biotic factors, and abiotic factors. All of these things are going to drive species and drive change. So if they give you some sort of graphic representation like the one on the right, what's most likely going to be leading to the biggest impact? Well, urchins. Urchins are. We can see that removing the limpets and the urchins is the best, but removing just the limpets had almost no impact. It's the urchins that had the major impact there. If you actually take the number of organisms that are born in a generation and track their entire life, you'll make a life table. And from that life table, you can then create survivorship curves. So humans are type 1 survivorship curves. We have high parental care in the early days, so we tend to survive in our early likelihood of death and die quickly at old age. Whereas something like an oyster, which reproduces lots and lots of young at first, but most of them don't survive. But if they do survive, they tend to live the whole lifespan. Okay, that would be a type 3 curve. And if something like the ground squirrel, like the chart on the left, they have an equal chance of dying at any point in time, roughly. So you end up with a type 2 curve. These aren't absolutes, but you'll notice that they never go up. Okay, you can't increase the number of survivors. Population growth can be sort of simplified into two major types of formulas. This is obviously an oversimplification, but the first being exponential. Okay, that's really only likely in new environments or when resources are not limiting. So over time, it tends to turn into a logistic. It's going to level off at K, carrying capacity. These formulas are on the math reference sheet, so you could be expected to use them. Just realize that R is the rate, N is the population size, K is the carrying capacity. dN over dt, d is delta, so that's the change in population over the change in time. Okay. K selected species and R selected species. K selected species tend to favor K, or the carrying capacity. That's going to be ones with high parental care or high energy investment into the young. R selected species are going to have very little energy investment into the young, very low parental care, and they're going to be going back and forth. So the dandelion would be an R selected species, whereas the Brazil nut is a K. Not because the tree is caring for the young, but because it's investing a lot of energy into those seeds and offspring. Species can then be regulated based upon density-dependent factors as well as density-independent factors. Density-dependent factors are going to be something that you're going to see more often. That's going to be things like predation and competition and waste and disease. Okay, density-independent are going to have an impact regardless of population. So it gets a little more complicated. When species begin to interact, we see that there's all sorts of different possibilities. You could have changes in sort of behavior. You could have changes in physiology. So like camouflage behavior is going to be sort of a predator-prey interaction driving up that process. Aposematic coloration, like the warning coloration, or something like mimicry. Okay. When organisms are plus plus, that's mutualistic. When organisms are minus minus, that's competition. Positive negative tends to be predation impacts, and then if you have a 0, that means there's no impact. Okay, it's either going to be a 0 plus, commensalistic, or a 0 minus, amensalism. 0-0 neutralism is argued not to exist because that's when nothing is happening in either direction, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, but predator-prey interactions are a major driving force of evolutionary change because of competition and survival rates. Notice that the spikes here are roughly parallel each other, but it's not an exact match. Okay, there's going to be differences in survival rates. There's going to be confounding variables that aren't represented here, like food availability, and there's also a lag. So the increase in moose led to an increase in wolf, but it wasn't immediate. It took time. Okay, so that's something to consider. We talked about competitive exclusion before, but that's still one of those driving forces. Invasive species become invasive because they fill an unused niche and then compete and spread and cause damage. Okay, but when organisms are in their entire niche without competition, that is their fundamental niche. But when competition is taken into impact, some of them are going to be excluded from some parts or another, and that's going to be their realized niche, where they actually live. Competitive exclusion limits that negative competitive behavior by splitting these things into basically micro niches, leading to less overlap, less conflict, more efficiency. When you're actually measuring species diversity, we're going to use Simpson's diversity index. The formula is on the math reference sheet, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it now. Other factors are going to be like species richness, looking at the number of species in an ecosystem, species evenness, and relative abundance. Look at how even or relatively abundant one is. So species A has a higher relative abundance in community 2, whereas community 1 has a higher species evenness, whereas both have an equal species richness at 4. Trophic levels are going to have an impact here, though. Keystone species, for example, have an outsized impact. Ecosystem engineers, aka foundation species, create habitat. Sometimes trophic interactions can be direct because of competition, predation, whatever. Sometimes they can be indirect. So the crab and the Spartina grasses have a positive trophic interaction because the crabs feed on the snails and the snails feed on the grass. So by eating the snail, it helps the grass. That would be a trophic cascade. That's an example of this process. When you're actually looking at ecosystems over time, that's going to be incorporating both the biotic and the abiotic. We find that disturbance is necessary to maximize biodiversity. We can see that on the left. But if there is too much disturbance, like ocean bottom trawling, that can lead to a collapse of diversity. If something happens to an ecosystem, then there's going to be secession. There's going to be change in the organism's distribution over time. Primary secession is going to be coming from bare rock. So that'll be like a new island or after glaciation or something. Secondary selection is going to be starting with soil already present, so maybe after a forest fire. But the pioneer organisms like grasses, lichens, bacteria are going to break down rock and make soil. Okay, and over time you'll be able to support more and more and more complex organisms through the seral stages until you reach something that's stable for long periods of time, which would be a climax community. So in this example, it would be like a hardwood forest. Most ecosystems are going to be a mosaic of things in different stages. It's not all as one. Like a tree falls in the middle of the forest, and now I've knocked that section back a few stages. So we're going to see differences there. But primary secession is rock. Secondary secession starts with soil. Biodiversity, though, is not just the species richness. Species richness is just one factor. You also have ecological diversity, functional diversity, genetic diversity. These things tie together to create biodiversity. And the role that those organisms play in their environment overall develop the ecosystem services that benefit all of life. So while we may not care about species diversity within itself, we do need to care about the ecosystem services that keep the rest of us alive. So there's definitely a need to pay attention to what's going on with the biodiversity crisis in the world right now. Extinction is going to be that loss of a branch that we talked about before. The extinction rate, the background extinction rate, is a natural process. It's meant to sort of happen as far as evolution is concerned. But because of human impacts on the environment, the background extinction rate is 10 to 100 to 1,000, depending on what you're looking at, times higher than it should be. Okay, threatened species are likely to go extinct, but not at sort of an immediate risk. Endangered species are going to be much more likely to go extinct. And so we're going to have to keep those under much closer watch. Human activities are a major threat to biodiversity, and it can be summarized in the mnemonic HIPCO. H is for habitat destruction and fragmentation. So it's looking at like suburban spreading and urban sprawl and the edge effects leading to the loss of things like bears, for example, in our local area, but the increase in things like raccoons and deer. So they can be positive and negative, depends upon what type of environment the organism lives. But you don't get upset about the bear coming into your neighborhood when it was a forest. The bear was there first. Sorry. Invasive species or introduced species is going to be the second one. They fill niches and they outcompete because there's no natural predators, no natural sort of stopping force. Over time, invasive species can be balanced out by native species, but it takes a long time and is not necessarily guaranteed. It can get complicated. Okay, our first P is going to be pollution. That could be something like a dead zone formation, like a river flow in the Gulf of Mexico. It could be bioaccumulation, where the toxins build up within an organism, mainly in their fat. It could be biomagnification, where because it's in the fat and organisms are consuming it, it gets more and more concentrated as you go up the trophic levels. But pollution can be a major driver of this process. Overpopulation is going to be our second P. Basically, population levels are too high to support ecosystems as they are. We are reproducing way above replacement fertility. Okay, So the goal is ZPG, or zero population growth. To do that, we need to be reproducing at replacement level fertility, which is around 2.1, 2.2. Why is it above 2? Well, not everybody has kids. Not every kid survives to reproductive age. But if we want to actually stop this crisis, we need to reduce our overpopulation. C is looking at issues of climate change. That could be global warming, looking at something like the excess of CO2. We need to realize, of course, that global warming is necessary for survival on Earth, but too much of anything is a bad thing. Trapping that heat is problematic. That is also going to be sort of falling under the umbrella here of ocean acidification. Basically, CO2 goes into ocean water, turns into carbonic acid. The carbonic acid creates stress. That stress drives things like shell deformation and coral loss. Sea level rise, land-based ice is melting, and warm water thermally expands. So sea level rise is a double problem, not just because of ice melting, but also warm water takes up more space. Okay. O is overexploitation, overharvesting, poaching, mining, overfishing. Okay, resources are limited, and without regulation and control, we tend to exploit out of greed, which is where the tragedy of the commons comes in, basically saying that resources and things, if they are a common good, they need regulation, otherwise we will lose them. And there's some fundamental problems with tragedy of the commons as far as the author is concerned, but the concept is still something that we can think about. If we want to try to protect species, there's really only a couple of ways you can do this. The first one, the so-called small population approach, says, okay, there is a minimum viable population. You need to do everything you can to keep populations at that minimum point or higher. Okay, you'll notice that the minimum population value on the right only depends upon breeding females. Pre-reproductive and post-reproductive don't matter. Okay, females and males, sorry, breeding. Okay, but if the organisms have entered an extinction vortex, they're much less likely to survive. So the only way that you're going to be able to recover species that are already in the extinction vortex is to bring in genes from another environment, which may or may not be possible. But maybe there's an isolated population that we can bring in to increase that diversity and leave this extinction vortex. If not, then the population is not really salvageable. The declining population approach is, okay, well, we need to do a lot of resources and research. We need to find out what is leading to the decline so that we can get the best bang for our buck. Okay, we did this with wolves and it was quite successful. But in like the example on the right for these birds, what was most effective was stopping the rats. Okay, the nest boxes were great, but if you did rat control, that was definitely part of it. So we need to focus our efforts on rat control and nest boxes in order to lead to survival rate and change. Okay, basically do research upfront, find what's causing the decline, fix it. Okay, you might also have things that are coming under this, like creating national parks and wildlife refuges that would fall under some of this window as well. If we can create protected spaces, maybe we can help these declining populations. What if the ecosystem's already damaged? What if we've already screwed it up? Well, natural recovery is a very slow process. So we tend to put, or we're trying to begin at least, to put effort into fixing the damage. Reclamation just basically cleans up the pollution and then sort of hopes that natural recovery can take it from there. Remediation processes are going to try to bring it back to a functional ecosystem. So that might be like phytoremediation, where we use plants to bring mining areas back, or we use sunflowers around nuclear waste sites, that kind of thing. Or it could be sort of a restoration effort, much more energy intensive, much more effort, but bringing it back to a healthy, sustainable ecosystem that it was before. We're never going to be able to get it back to full natural. We're not good at it, but we're still putting the effort in. So if we're trying to basically fix the damage, it's going to cost us, but we need to do it if we want long-term survival. There are other forms of ecology and other components that we could talk about here, but that's sort of the crash course of the most common topics, and I hope that helped.